Hi, Misha. Great to have you here.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Good afternoon here in
Good
Israel.
afternoon. Yes, sir.
So this is the first of what I hope will be a series of these types of videos. And as a reminder to the audience as well as to ourselves, the intention behind the interview is to create a companion resource to go with the Medicare Advantage validation cheat sheet that you and I created together. And the idea is to really go deeper into some of the less obvious or more important points that have been covered by the questions in there. And really the idea came about is because as we were developing this cheat sheet together, we had so many interesting conversations. I personally had so many insights, and I'm hoping to capture some of that here for the audience. And so at a high level, as a reminder, the focus here is on really helping the listeners hone in on the main three issues that tend to hinder adoption of whatever it is you're selling in healthcare. Number one, as we know, it's not enough to just solve a problem. You need to really understand with precision how you're going to stand out in the context of relative priorities. And so the first section of questions in this cheat sheet, they lay out all the high level value propositions that you might be bringing as a vendor to help guide messaging and ensure that you stand out above the noise of vendors. Number two, you really need to plan for potential barriers to adoption that are common in healthcare, such as the need to integrate with legacy tech stacks, workflow, and evidence needed for your adoption. So we kind of delve into these more tactical topics as well. And then number three is understanding how the money flows and how to best position your offering for available budgets. And it really starts with awareness of what budgets are even available to tap into. But before we begin, let's kick off by hearing a bit about you, Misha, and your own background within the MAO space.
Thank you, Jonathan. So I've been in the US healthcare for the better part of 23 years now. Started with private ambulance company, so I was on a provider side of business. Then joined corporate America, spent 3 years at DaVita, providing dialysis services company, first in their center operations and then supporting their special needs plan for ESRD patients. That was my first introduction to managed healthcare. They were a disease management arm of SCAN. And then I transitioned to United Health Group, where I first started with pharmacy product, then spent some time on senior sup, which is basically the group component or group side of the med sup that most probably are familiar with, and eventually transitioning in Medicare Advantage, working on supplemental benefits where most of the vendors, most of the startups I think are playing. Eventually ended up leading a product strategy and innovation team within United Health Group segment, supporting over 30 supplemental benefit products. Did that right about until May of last year, where I decided that the one place in healthcare I haven't played with is consulting. And there were some interesting concepts, interesting companies that came with opportunities to really kind of transform some of the healthcare parts that I think are important. So I've been supporting companies for the last year and a half now, from kind of pre-seed startups all the way to pretty mature companies within the healthcare space.
Amazing. And I know you're working already with one of our portfolio companies who are really appreciating the interaction.
And I appreciate the introduction.
So let's dive right into it. For those following along, you can grab the cheat sheet at linebird.com/MAO-cheat-sheet. Now let's start out at the top. Not all Medicare Advantage plans are the same. And in fact, there are three main categories of plans that we outlined in the cheat sheet. And so what are they, and what should vendors selling into this space know about how each of these differ in terms of which value proposition most resonates for each?
Yeah, great question. And I think step number one, understanding, as you mentioned, that they're not all the same. While Medicare Advantage is kind of that global name, you really have to dissect which specific Medicare Advantage segment you're interested in. And you can broadly define them as group Medicare Advantage, basically where your previous employer or union or trust are providing healthcare coverage for those who have retired. Individual Medicare Advantage, where individuals literally basically give their Medicare plan to the Medicare Advantage plan. And then you have special needs plans, and those further subdivide into multiple groups. Most familiar to people is probably dual Medicare Advantage, where you have both Medicare and Medicaid, as well as CSNPs, they're called, chronic special needs plan for specific conditions. And there's a smaller subset, institutional special needs plans, that I think probably not as interesting to the majority of the audience. But all of those have slightly different rules, certainly have different demographics of people, different value propositions going to most resonate with them. And what's also very interesting, that if you take one organization and you try to sell into, let's say, group Medicare Advantage, individual Medicare Advantage, and special needs plans, you're probably talking to three different teams, and they're not necessarily talking to each other. You would hope they may, but it's very possible they don't. So I think that's very important to know, that just because you have a contact or an opportunity to present to an organization, you really have to understand what that team is leading, what is it working on, and that will drive both your pitch, your value prop, and your ability to influence their decision.
Sure. Sometimes, we talk to startup founders, and founders will say, I'm talking to someone at Blue Cross. Okay, which one and which group, and how do you even really understand what's driving them and why they're talking to you without this knowledge? It's
absolutely
pretty baseline. And so for those following the space, we know the past few years, Medicare Advantage as a whole has grown very quickly in popularity, and it's actually even forecasted to overtake fee-for-service, regular Medicare, in the next few years. And especially we've seen very fast growth in the individual and the special needs plans segments, making it a pretty competitive space. And so plans have needed to invest in better marketing and in differentiating themselves, both in the eyes of brokers and consumers, and are paying more attention to A&R, attraction and retention related products. And so as a vendor looking to sell MAOs on this value prop, how can you perhaps tell whether your offering might move the needle on A&R, and if that's what you should be pitching yourself towards?
Yeah. I believe the number today is that average consumer has a choice of 47 different plans they can choose from. So certainly acquisition, and to your point, retention, because a lot of the plans, from my understanding, really lose money on the first year of having the member, and it takes time for clinical programs and other interventions to really make a difference in the member lives, or healthcare journey and engagement. So retention is just as important as acquisition. So you can't just have a shiny object that brings the member in and then does not really provide value. So I think for those who are playing in that space, it's really understanding the geography where they are. Special needs plans, individuals plans are mostly geographically located and based, and understanding who the competition is, who is offering what, and how those benefits compare between plans. And all that information is publicly available. You do have to do a little bit of research, but it is out there. And then trying to figure out what is lacking in that offering of the payer that you're talking to. What can you bring to the table that will position them differently than the market, or position them better? Maybe you have an offering that is not new, but is significantly less expensive or easier to implement, or has generated better value in your experience. That is something that is likely to grab the attention of the payer you're speaking to, and then position you for a potential opportunity.
Makes sense. And another obvious value prop that we cover in the cheat sheet is, of course, reduction in the total cost of care. And so to set the context for listeners, maybe explain how MAOs typically think through things like medical loss ratio goals and how they evaluate ROI for new products and initiatives. Specifically, what metrics and criteria are typically considered during this evaluation process?
Yeah, so maybe we can just step back for 1 second and speak of kind of the 4 pillars that, in my opinion, are really important for all Medicare Advantage organizations. And that would be retention, acquisition of members, which we have touched upon. Second is reduction in total cost of care and revenue maximization. They somewhat go together. And the final one is reduction administrative burden, that we can talk about it later. But obviously, the way that MAOs work is they get money from CMS. They may have a premium from a member, and that is their total revenue pool. From that revenue pool, they have to pay their administrative costs, they have to pay providers and claims. Providers, claims, all of the costs associated with actual medical care, that's your cost of care. Any reduction in that cost of care is basically additional margin profit opportunity for investment for MAOs. So they are absolutely interested in how can they provide high quality of care and spend less. I know that sounds relatively straightforward. The problem is, how do you attribute your specific intervention to a reduction in total cost of care? And that is a difficult problem to solve, both for the vendors and for MAOs. As far as ROI, I think that we have seen quite a shift in kind of plan expectations. We used to look at 2 years to break even, maybe 3 years to break even. A lot of plans expect almost an in-year ROI, and certainly look at probably 2.5 to 3 times ROI on their investment, and within much more shortened kind of condensed timelines. All that goes to say that while it's very difficult to have kind of proof points that it's for sure going to reduce total cost of care and the ROI is there, you certainly can use correlation, and you can use kind of conceptual understanding with, I would argue, potentially taking risk on some of the KPIs that are you can devise with plans together. In my opinion, again, that's how you can really differentiate yourself. If you're confident in your product, if you believe that your intervention would truly move a needle on a specific patient population or an overall population, putting some skin in a game and saying that we are so confident that we can do something together, that we're willing to take some of the risk, could really position you better for MAO to take an opportunity with you.
And so related to this topic of financial ROI and how to make it easier to adopt your solution, let's also touch upon validation of clinical evidence. In other areas of healthcare, some may be familiar with things like traditional medical devices and drug companies. Because of the sometimes riskier safety profiles there, we are used to a standard pathway involving FDA regulation and often randomized controlled trials. What should people know about the path for vendors to MAOs in proving outcomes? Is it necessary to go through those same clinical validation pathways, or is the standard something else?
So I'm relatively biased that third-party studies, or even more importantly, internal studies, really don't probably have as much weight as people would hope they do. There's a joke that you tell me the result, and I'll make the data tell me the results you want. What I think is important is to get really precise as to what clinical outcomes you can influence. I think the term clinical outcomes as an umbrella is just, first of all, overused and truly doesn't mean anything. But things like reduction in medication utilization, something that you can actually measure on a population before and after. Reduction in ER visits, in hospitalizations for the population you're serving before and after. Things like loneliness scores, NPS, of course, but also just getting, and I'm going to be repetitive because I think it's important, getting extremely precise as to what you can influence and what you can measure and what the plan will believe you have impacted. So I think those bullet points is something you have a conversation with the plan you're trying to sell into, and then agree collectively that those are the metrics that will define success or not success of the specific program you're working on. But there are things that you can measure. They're hard to measure, but they do exist. But I would really stay away from kind of broad statements of we're going to provide great clinical outcomes and reduce overall cost. You have to get much more specific.
So really sticking to things that can easily be measured via readily available claims data that the payer is able to analyze, or survey data, or other means that are within the grasp of the vendor and their partner.
Yeah, I mean, a few examples of that. Also, not to discount that quite often vendors and providers that actually work with the member have information that the health plan may not have. They may have learned that the member has fallen, or have started having difficulty hearing, or difficulty having or have no appetite. So that information relating back to the health plan actually makes the intervention different intervention, but intervention nonetheless proactive versus reactive. That in itself has inherent value. And again, things that you can measure, maybe not necessarily even through claims, but through self-reporting by the member as well as self-reporting by the health plan. For example, PCP attribution, enhancing member not adherence, but having a PCP, going to an annual wellness visits, receiving a home visit. So not just a reduction in something, but an increase in engagement in healthcare. That is absolutely valuable as well.
That's useful. And so lastly, within this section, in Medicare Advantage, there's a big focus on patient experience. And we hear a lot about stars ratings as a key economic driver in MAO. Now, given the amount of ratings and the aggregate score and the fact that those weightings are being updated every year, plus the complexity of calculating it and of influencing it at the plan level, you and I agreed ahead of time we're not going to go too deep into discussing this here because this can easily be its own video and entire resource. But we did include a few links about that subject in the cheat sheet. That said, if we were to try to simplify and almost envision it as a matrix showing, which stars measures are the ones on the one hand most influenceable by vendors and on the other, which have the most impact. I wonder what your view is on how vendors can best go about figuring out what MAOs are willing to pay for and what catches their attention as a value prop as related to star ratings.
Well, let's start with the fact that most, if not all, MAOs either contract out or have internal teams fully dedicated to stars and driving for 5 stars when possible, or probably that's the goal of every plan. So coming in and saying we're going to influence your stars and being the direct methodology of doing so, it's probably relatively aggressive and probably not very believable. However, coming in and saying that we can make your pursuit easier because we have certain tools, methodologies, approaches that are going to help you along your way for this specific star measure, I think there's value in that. You mentioned member experience. Member experience is a must. If you provide poor member experience or your solution deteriorates member experience, that's a non-starter. I think that, as you mentioned, ever updating measures as well as different things that the health plans have to check mark and measure, understanding what those are year over year, that is widely published and there's a multitude of opinions on it, and then picking the ones that you truly believe you can influence. So if you can, and I'm going to use probably the most overused word, but medication adherence. If you believe that you can really influence medication adherence, and that's a problem for an MAO, and I think those two have to go together, then you should speak to that. You shouldn't approach a plan saying I can improve something that they already have improved. And if you don't believe you can improve it simultaneously, you should not talk about it. There's a multitude of other value props within selling cycle to MAO that are not related directly to stars. And if you are going to talk about stars, I believe you have to really make sure you really understand that plan star ratings, where they're looking to improve, and that you can really influence. Otherwise, you're just going to sell a solution that's not sellable.
Yeah, and I think that's the hardest part as I've seen it. I mean, it makes rational sense that if you're able to impact one of the elements of the stars ratings, that is something MAOs would be interested in. But when you have 50 or 100 or I don't know how many different components to this composite score and you're maybe impacting only a select few of them, I wonder how much that value proposition really breaks through. So I think it's a great way of describing it, both what is influenceable, but also make sure that it actually is going to, that the messaging around helping with the stars rating is actually going to be something that breaks through as a must-have.
And I would also offer to people to not be afraid to ask the question. There's nothing wrong in your conversation to say, are there areas within your clinical outcomes, within your star pursuit, where you believe we can help you? People like to be asked questions, and I think you actually show up better when you don't assume, when you ask questions that may lead you to different opportunities.
Going back to the cheat sheet, skipping ahead a bit, on page 10, we have question 3, which is who pays and how. Very important section. And within that section, we have in the list a question: from which budget will MAOs pay for your product offering? And it includes things like medical loss ratio dollars, CMS rebate dollars, innovation dollars, etc. I was not even aware there were so many different types of pools to draw from. And so the question is, simplifying it for the audience, why should startups care which budget is utilized as long as it's being paid for? Could you maybe discuss the differences between each of these budget types in terms of target audience, timeline, stability, and how that might impact your pricing model and positioning of your offering? And then secondly, not to put too much in one question, but maybe you can go into some of the differences between some of these budget pools to help the audience understand, what it means in terms of who you might be selling to within the plan, the size and stability of some of these budgets, etc. Are all these budgets equally attractive to be, targeting?
You asked a lot in one question. Well, let's start with the fact that most, and if we're talking primarily about individual plans or special needs plans, they all file bids. And for those who are not familiar with bids are, I really recommend spending a few minutes learning about Medicare Advantage bid process. But the bottom line is they have to account for the dollars they spend. They receive dollars from CMS, they receive dollars from premiums if those exist in their plans, and they have to account how they're going to spend those dollars. So it's really hard to come in last minute and say, here's a new product, here's a new offering, please include it in your plan offering because we're going to do X, Y, and Z if the bids have already been filed. And that usually happens in the June, or does happens in the June of a year prior to the plan year. That being said, clinical programs are usually MLR, medical loss ratio dollars, right? And those are clinical programs that are specifically there to improve clinical, I'm being repetitive and redundant, but improve members' health. So your surgery, your inpatient hospitalization, your convalescent home. I would think that majority of our audience are probably fit into the supplemental benefits category, and those are the benefits that come from rebate dollars, and they're not clinical programs. The bottom line is within Medicare, they're not coming out of a medical loss ratio. So they're coming out of a different pool where there's a lot of competition for those dollars, both from the established programs. I'll give you an example: dental, vision, hearing, transportation. Those are already coming out of supplemental dollars. So you have a higher mountain to climb to compete for those dollars. A lot of plans also have rewards and incentive dollars or innovation dollars or stars dollars, they call them. Basically, money allocated to try new things, to invest in new things. Unless you're incredibly lucky, your conversation with an MAO will probably result in a pilot. And that pilot will be there to prove concept of what you can bring to the table. And it's very possible that funding for that pilot will come from those innovation dollars, or basically internal dollars positioned to try out new vendors and new things. So talking to the innovation officers, understanding where they are in their spend, because those innovation dollars, as far as I understand, go away if not spent, and not aiming to automatically get yourself into that supplemental bucket or get into even if you have a clinical program, into the MLR, and understanding that pilot can probably be funded by additional sources or sources that do exist. And then once you prove concept, you can really scale, and then your competition is not as difficult to overcome.
Interesting. And we also have in the question list under the same section of who pays and how, the question of how will your offering be brought to market, with options such as supplemental benefit, clinical program, etc. And so maybe you can elaborate also on how will the answer to this question potentially tie in with the value prop you're bringing to market and the budgets that you might be able to tap into.
Yeah, you have to understand what you're going to be filed as, or what are you going to be offered as, right? Are you a traditional supplemental benefit? I'm probably going to use a lot of terms that may not be necessarily familiar, but CMS in recent years have really relaxed the definition of supplemental benefit, really allowed for additional benefits to be offered to members to address certain either socioeconomic or condition-specific issues that members may be experiencing. You'll probably have heard things like SSBCI, special supplemental benefits for chronically ill members. What that basically means is that you can offer a different benefit to a subset of your population, kind of bypassing or the uniformity requirement. And those programs have their own, I'm not going to say budgets, but their own line items because they have very specific purposes. So understanding whether you're going to be a general supplemental benefit, I don't know, you created a brand new ways to offer dental that has not been done, and you're going to be kind of the check mark of a health plan, you have a new dental offering, or you're bringing something completely new and different for patients with hypertension and diabetes, and you want to try it on that specific population. So understanding of how you're going to fit into the ecosystem of a health plan is incredibly important because that is going to define A, who you're competing against, B, which market you're probably going to be attractive to, and C, how you're going to be funded.
Great, super helpful. Now, as we both know, unfortunately, a strong value proposition and a defined budget to draw from is a great place to start, but oftentimes not enough. You also need to make it very easy to purchase and implement your solution. And related to that, to be aware of some of the barriers to adoption that MAOs face. And the biggest one, I think, to start with is the annual enrollment cycle, which we actually included an entire little chart on in page 12 of the cheat sheet within the appendix. And so maybe you could give some more details on how this annual enrollment cycle works and what it means for vendors selling to MAOs in terms of sales cycles, and also what categories of offerings or budgets are subject to this and which are not.
Yeah. So right now we're in Q3 of 2023, which means that all the decisions for 2024 plan year have been already made. Selling today for 2024 would be, in my opinion, pretty much impossible. And in about a month and a half, if not now, conversation about 2025 are starting. The important dates is basically the release of the advance call letter by CMS and then the final call letter from CMS. They happen in February and then subsequently in April. And they really show what CMS is going to be paying house plans. I'm certainly simplifying, but bottom line, they will understand what are they going to be looking at in terms of revenue, and that will define their budgets, and that will then define their planning process, which happens, as I mentioned, preliminary conversations happen in Q4 of 2023. We're talking about 2025 plan year, and then the first quarter of 2024 is really the best time to be part of the conversation. Well, hopefully your conversation started now, but really be part of the offering discussion for 2025. As I mentioned, after the April call letter, when all the numbers are finalized, bid process starts, and that bid process is going to be completed in June. And anything after that, you're really looking at maybe potentially doing a small pilot, which will be, as you mentioned, funded by innovation or rewards and incentives dollars. But in terms of being truly included as a benefit for the next plan year, those conversations need to happen Q4 of the year before, or I'm sorry, more than a year before, and then Q1 of the year prior to. And that is usually something that I found founders and startups don't quite visualize right away, that the selling cycle for Medicare Advantage is probably 18 months, which is both challenging, but also gives you the opportunity to really ramp up those conversations.
And I think as VCs, oftentimes we're investing in startups. The kind of default is to provide 24 months of runway, but if you're investing in a startup that is selling into this sales cycle, you really need to take into account these annual enrollment cycles and make sure you have enough shots at it before the next round to get anywhere as a startup commercially. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, and related to sales cycle is organizational structure. And so what should vendors know in terms of how the different decision-making systems of large insurers work and how that may impact timing expectations beyond just that annual enrollment cycle?
Yeah, great question. And, if you know one health plan, you know one health plan. There's absolutely no as far as I have seen, consistency of who makes the final decision or where that decision is made. Often it's really the product team within a health plan that is looking to bring new products to the table. Often it's a clinical team that is looking at innovation and maybe are driving innovation. The final decision maker, and it really depends on the size of your pilot, the size of your program, could be somebody, a P&L owner for a segment. Sometimes it has to go higher. You're certainly going to run into finance, underwriting, actuarial, legal, where you have to be prepared to basically answer those questions. And the ideal scenario is to bring multiple teams to the table. It's not beyond imagination, unfortunately, that the product team was in a health plan and the clinical team was in a health plan might have very different priorities. And bringing them together, you may learn that what one thing is important, another one doesn't, and vice versa. You can potentially bridge that gap, but at the very least, you will see the likelihood of your product being sold based on who the decision maker is and based on alignment of priorities. As far as how long does it take, unless they're looking for your specific solution for a very specific reason, I would say a realistic expectation is 3 to 6 months from the first conversation to pilot. And that's assuming you have passed the technology and safety and compliance. There's usually an MSA involved. There's an assessment process. Contract negotiations or SOWs can take a very long time. So pack your patience. There's absolutely no urgency on the side of the health plan to bring your solution to market.
And then as you get past that process of, the sales cycle, MSA, contracting, oftentimes, what we see in order to prove the impact of your offering or to promote utilization, integrations are necessary. And, oftentimes as large health plans, these Medicare Advantage organizations are not the easiest to integrate with in terms of their tech stacks. And so what types of integrations do vendors typically request from these groups, and what expectations are reasonable to have in this regard?
I think for the initial pilot, again, the integrations, you have to have an ability to receive eligibility file securely, and then an ability to report back to the health plan with probably patient data of your either its outcomes or ongoing process and expectations. I think it's really difficult and probably not realistic to truly integrate with a claims data system or any real other systems within the health plans. But what I want to touch upon is just making it easy for the health plan to work with you. We have to remember that time is valuable, and those teams are usually overworked and potentially understaffed. So bringing a new vendor is not simple. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of internal work from both setting up the member-facing language, creating the right check marks with the legal compliance, and so on. So making it as simple as possible and really tailoring your position to the health plan. And I know that sounds a little bit, the answer kind of has to be, the answer is yes, what's the question? And making it simple for that health plan to really work with you, whether from the reporting templates or from receipt of eligibility files, and knowing that you have to be unsure if you're working within Medicare, that your call center has to be unsure, that a lot of the data most likely cannot be touched offshore at all, and having those capabilities and expectations up front and really presenting them up front to the health plan really shortens some of the discussion. You don't have to bring up those questions later, in other words.
Excellent. And for those of you following along with the cheat sheet, we cover many of those points in page 7. Are you prepared for the associated timelines of contracting and implementation, the requirements? That's well covered there. And so you touched upon it briefly, but I think it's worth double clicking in vendor reporting requirements. So when I was first learning about this domain, the natural assumption was that payers would want their vendors or even require them to send timely access to their data as it can inform case management. Oftentimes they don't have this information in their systems, but the reality can be very different. So can you talk about what levels of reporting most vendors have, and what are the usual expectations in terms of reporting capabilities?
I would say that reporting is probably one of the most undervalued and not very well invested in area that vendors and founders talk about. You have to be able to communicate what you have done and what you're doing in a way that the house plan can consume. And I think that's the important differentiation. And that comes from conversations. What data is important to you? Clearly, eligibility or retention of the member in a program, whatever KPIs you're measuring is important. And really tailoring that reporting component to a reporting package to the house plan needs and finding a way to do that in a cadence that they can act upon. So I think data has to be not just clear and understood, but it has to be actionable. What we have seen more and more now is having live dashboards that house plans can log into and have access to information, whether it's Tableau or some other tool, I think has been really something that house plans are starting to appreciate and something that they can actually, quote unquote, play with within and generate different reports on a specific member and a specific member cohort. I'm assuming, and I'm not a tech person, unfortunately, but I'm assuming that those tools are a lot more accessible, a lot less expensive nowadays than they have been. So at least offering the real-time dashboard access has been something that house plans have been looking for lately.
And another key barrier to adoption is often end user engagement, especially in MAOs. It's a senior population, not always digitally savvy and not always able to take advantage of the latest technology. And so, what capabilities do vendors usually build to, or should they be building to engage patients in their offerings? And what support or limitations can they expect from MAOs in this?
Yeah, and I think you kind of touched upon could versus should. I think digital front door, digital first is probably the most overused sentence that I have heard at a house plan. And I think it's not the matter of if, it's a matter of timing. I think we will get there where majority of the population is tech savvy, especially with 10,000 younger people retiring every day who are probably a lot more versed in technology. But it's not quite there yet, in my humble opinion, which means that technology is being used, but you also have to have, I call it off-app experience, meaning that anything that a member can do via an app or a website, they have to be able to do telephonically and in person. Sorry, not in person, but telephonically. And I think I personally get a lot of resistance from companies saying, but why? That's just the reality of Medicare population, especially if you're talking about dual population, where you may have people from different ethnic backgrounds, people who do not have access to reliable internet or have never used it and don't want to. And again, I think that is changing, but I don't think it's quite there yet. So an ability to have a off-app experience, I think, is really still important for products and services that are not just entirely telehealth or virtual. If that is your realm, I totally understand it. But if you're offering an experience where members can use or not use, they have to be able to do it not just via technology, but also through traditional methodology.
That's a great way to think about it. And sometimes in digital health, we assume across the board that engagement is a good thing. But when you're a vendor to MAOs, this might not always be the case. And so can you tell us more about how a vendor may think about how engagement ties into the value of their offerings?
Unfortunately, a lot of house plans, or maybe not unfortunately, but the reality is sometimes house plans look to bring in a new product or a new vendor really simply as a retention or acquisition tool, which means they don't want utilization because utilization is going to cost them money. Ideally, you want to be able to hit multiple pillars of house plan needs, be both retention acquisition, but also a tool to help them control cost, increase revenue, and improve clinical outcomes, in which case you want utilization, and utilization is something that is actually going to drive that engagement. The problem is that members get asked or get touched by a house plan multiple times a year in hundreds, which means making your offering stand out is very difficult. Most of the house plans are not going to allow you to send your own mailers or send your own marketing materials, both because of the regulation, but also because of just what the house plan need the member to pay attention to. And it's most likely not your product. So the more you can offer in terms of, I call it engagement tool, where you basically tell the health plan that by using my product or driving members to my product or offering, you will achieve other things that are important to you. You will increase annual wellness visits. You will drive PCP attribution. You will increase home visits. That's basically, that's a convincing tool. It could be a convincing tool of why they want to double click on promoting your offering, your website, your whatever, because that's going to drive other important proposition for a health plan. But the idea that your offering in itself, kind of as a standalone solution, will be heavily promoted by a health plan is most likely not going to happen.
That's great. And if you are following along with the cheat sheet in page 13 within the recommended resources, Misha included the UHC virtual education site, which is very valuable in terms of if you are a beneficiary facing vendor, understanding what the promotion by a MAO may look like for the member. You know, we've touched upon many of the challenges of selling to MAOs, many of the nuances. Maybe to end on a light note and to remind ourselves, you know, why should founders and investors in the digital health arena be paying close attention to MAOs as budget holders for innovation in healthcare? Why should, you know, founders be excited about selling into this space and the impact they can make?
I think it's a wonderful question. So I'm just going to throw some numbers at you that kind of resonate. 10,000 people a day, it's probably more now, retiring into Medicare Advantage, into Medicare, forgive me. We have just crossed the line of more than 50% of people now choose Medicare Advantage as opposed to standalone Medicare. That is only going to continue. Medicare Advantage is probably one of the only issues that Congress has bipartisan opinion on, and supporting Medicare Advantage is actually a priority for both Democrats and Republicans, which is almost impossible to find nowadays. So it's a growing market. It's sustainable. It's not going away. And I think the most interesting component that maybe is a little bit new to people is that while it's a huge industry and, you know, a few big companies dominate it, the truth is it's still a small club. So if you come up with a solution that really works, it's not just going to be accepted by one health plan, it'll be copied by others. So the opportunity for scaling of successful products are pretty enormous. So it's really hard to get into, it's hard to scale, but it also has a tremendous opportunity for growth. And it's a market segment that is not going away.
I think that's a wrap. Thank you so much, Misha, for joining me today. Thanks for taking part in this project. How can people best reach you if they want to follow up and learn more about what you're
absolutely.
up to?
Please find me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to engage with anybody and happy to have a conversation. And as Jonathan and I mentioned multiple times, this is impossible to describe in an hour. Any of these topics and sub-segments can take a multitude of hours to get into, but there's also not a way to learn it and not to get overwhelmed. So happy to support anybody who is interested.
Thank you so much. I think oftentimes when we look at healthcare, there are so many stakeholders that are really struggling now, whether it's provider groups that are suffering on their margin profile, whether it's skilled nursing facilities, for example, and Medicare Advantage really is an exception in the fact that, in the sense that they have such incredible tailwinds behind them and are driving a lot of the profitability for these large health plans, and will continue to do so even more so in the future.
Absolutely.
I think we got most of what we need. I've got another one, when we think about budgets and how bids in the MAO space evolve year to year, they're linked to the macro environment as well as a competitive landscape. What impact might this have on the openness of plans to new benefits in the 2025 cycle? But I think the answer is just depressing, right? I don't know that.
Yeah, I don't
that
think
it's
we.
worth,
I don't think we.
yeah,
I don't think we. I don't think we know the answer yet. To be honest,
yeah,
I think
yeah.
we'll know in a few months. Listen,
Yeah.
I have to. I have to drop, but
Sure, me too.
let's reconnect, and we can have another 30-minute session if we need to on kind of
Yeah,
some other questions. Awesome.
I'll let you know. I think we got a lot of good material today. Thank you for
No,
you
thank
spoke
you.
great, and this is
I
fun.
appreciate it.
I think it was great. I think this is super.
Okay.
I mean, I personally think it's super interesting. I think anyone who is interested in really getting up to speed in MAOs, and any investor that that wants
I
to
think we're
invest in
gonna,
the space.
yeah,
This is super interesting. Yeah.
I think we're gonna hopefully we'll open some eyes. People have very, well, you and I have touched upon this a million times, just the selling cycle. And I think the other one, that because you have a solution doesn't mean they have a problem. And very long priority list that they often never meet, meaning that they are not going to get to all the things they want to do, both because of financials and resource and just timing. And knowing where your solution may fit on that priority list is probably the best gift you can give yourself before starting to sell. Ten 10,000 people a day, it's probably more now retiring into Medicare Advantage, into Medicare, forgive me. We have just crossed the line of more than 50% of people now choose Medicare Advantage as opposed to standalone Medicare. That is only going to continue. Medicare Advantage is probably one of the only issues that Congress has bipartisan opinion on, and supporting Medicare Advantage is actually a priority for both Democrats and Republicans, which is almost impossible to find nowadays. So it's a growing market, it's sustainable, it's not going away. And I think the most interesting component that maybe is a little bit new to people is that while it's a huge industry and a few big companies dominate it, the truth is it's still a small club. So if you come up with a solution that really works, it's not just going to be accepted by one health plan, it'll be copied by others. So the opportunity for scaling a successful products are pretty enormous. So it's really hard to get into, it's hard to scale, but it also has a tremendous opportunity for growth, and it's a market segment that is not going away.